start. Okay, here we go. So, we're back studying the 12 disciples. Quiz time. Who can name 12 disciples? We've already done 2, right? So who were the 2 that we did?
Simon, Peter, Andrew.
Simon, Peter, and Andrew. And today we're doing?
James.
Right, so we're already 1/3 of the way there. Or a quarter of the way there. Who else? Who's another disciple?
John.
John, yes.
James'
brother, yeah.
The other Simon.
The other Simon. The Zealot, yes, Simon the Zealot.
There's Philip.
Philip. Matthew.
There's the 2 Judas.
Yes, we have Judas, or also known as Thaddeus or Labius, and Judas Iscariot. Thomas, the twin. You're there. And I think you're just missing one. Bartholomew, also known as Nathaniel. So good job, Vivian. Everyone else, you're slacking. I'm just kidding. All right, so we're studying James today. Now, we also missed the other James. Sorry, because there's 2 James. So very specific. This is James, right? And I'm just finding some of these pictures of artwork for, just because there's kind of seen often around Europe in a lot of the cathedrals and stuff. So St. James, right? And it says up there, the son of Zebedee, because that's how he's referred to in the Bible. So once again, we're going to talk about occupation, right? What did he do for a living? His family, how he found Christ, or how Christ found him, and then the life after the resurrection. So I get to keep reusing this slide one more time because the next disciple is John. That one, you're going to have to hold tight for that lesson. It's going to be a few weeks because next week we go to the downtown core, right? And then I think the week after that, I have to teach a combined class because Candace will be staying with Hudson because of the surgery. All right, so James. James was a fisherman, right? We know this from Scripture. And he was part of a fishing business with his father and Andrew, Simon, Peter, and John, his brother. And once again, that is the type of fish that they mainly fished for, which was mango tilapia. So remember, next time you eat tilapia, you should think of the 4 fishermen from the Bible, as well as all the other fishing stories from the Bible, right? Does anybody like tilapia? Yeah, I like tilapia. I think it's all right. It's not my favorite fish, right? But it's pretty good. All right, and we're still holding on to this slide, right? Because they had a fishing business together. They lived and worked in the same area. So James also lived in both Bethsaida and Capernaum. So I added arrows so you can see them a little bit better where that is on the Sea of Galilee. Once again, Sea of Galilee, just like a really big lake, about 8 miles wide, 13 miles long. And then it's in this area of the Galilean area, right? So the kind of surrounding area around that sea. And then here's a bigger map again. I'm showing this over and over again so you get the repetition of where things are. Because a lot of times we're just reading the Bible and we don't really understand the distance or the geography or what's going on, right? So we have the Sea of Galilee up here, right? And that is where at least the big 4 disciples, I say the big 4 because they're mentioned the most in the Bible. So the big 4 being Simon, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, all growing up right on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. We have the Jordan River, right? The important part about the Jordan River is that John the Baptist was preaching up and down the Jordan River, right? So he was kind of going all around that area. And then we have Jerusalem all the way down here at the bottom. And Jerusalem is kind of like the Hebrew capital of the world during Jesus' time, right? It's where the main hub of Judaism is at. And they're kind of far apart. I think it was like 120 miles, right? So you couldn't just necessarily walk that in a couple of days, right? It takes some time. And then you also hear a lot about Samaria and Samaritans in the Bible, right? And you can kind of see that this is like the Samaria area, right? Now, fun fact, what's a Samaritan? Like today, what's a Samaritan?
Oh, like a good person.
It's somebody that does a good deed, right? And we get that from the parable that Jesus tells us about the Good Samaritan, right? But Samaritans back then, right, were kind of like an offshoot of Judaism. They kind of like split ways. There's a long history lesson that we could do here, but they really only believed in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, or the Torah, right? And there's a lot that goes into that, but basically the Jews down in Jerusalem, they didn't necessarily like Samaritans, and they didn't get along, and they didn't think that they were true Jews, right? And their main capital was not Jerusalem. They actually had Mount Gerizim, I think is what it's called. That's where they kind of built like their big religious center around that area. Okay, so family, right? We know because in the Bible it says a lot that James and John are the sons of Zebedee, right? That's kind of a cool name, Zebedee, right? Anytime you get a Z name, we don't get those very often anymore. And you also know that he's a brother to John, right? And so that's all backed up by Scripture. But Zebedee, we know that he was a man of affluence and had connections, right? The Bible tells us that he had hired men, right? So if we read down, so we know that he had affluence and connections because when Jesus got arrested, right, we see that Simon Peter and another disciple, who was John, were following Jesus. Because the disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, right? But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple was known to the high priest, came back and spoke to the servant girl on duty there and brought Peter in, right? We know that they were Levites, right? And so they were probably related to the high priest or had very good connections with them, most likely through Zebedee, right? We're going to read later on that he had hired men. And so that kind of means that he had maybe had some wealth to him as well. So meeting Jesus, right? So unlike Andrew, Peter, and John, he's not mentioned as a follower of John the Baptist, right? In the Gospel of John, we will often read about those 3 meeting Jesus after being a follower of John the Baptist, right? And then the other Gospels usually start off with some sort of fishing experience when they're called to full-time ministry. We don't hear about James in that first bit before he gets called by Christ fishing. So maybe he was not a follower of John the Baptist, but we know his brother John, the disciple John, was a follower of John the Baptist. But it's not mentioned in Scripture, so we don't know. But his calling to Christ we do see in Scripture, and it is while he is fishing, and it takes place after Simon and Andrew are called to Christ. And so there's quite a little bit difference between Mark and Matthew. And we'll read from Matthew 4 first. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. So that's Simon and Andrew being called. Going on from there, he saw 2 other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. So they're just out fishing, and Jesus calls from the shore, says, "Come follow me," and they just drop everything and go. right? Not only that, their dad is in the boat with them, and they're like, hey, see you, Dad, right? We don't get to hear about Zebedee's reaction, right? But we assume that a man of his prominence was probably okay with it, right? Because generally the father, the head of the household, has, the rule to say whatever he wants, even of his adult sons. But Mark 1 has a slightly different take on it, and I want you to see if you can notice it. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once they left their nets and followed him. When he had gone a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat preparing their nets. Without delay, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in a boat with the hired men and followed him. So, both Matthew and Mark are describing two very similar things, right? And what is the main difference? Actually, there's no real main. There's a small difference. The small difference is in Mark, is that he left their father in the boat with the hired men, right? So it's not just a family business, right? This is a pretty big fishing business for them to have hired men, right? It's no longer just mom and pop, right? This is hired men, so they have probably men being multiple, right? So it's at least two. So they're probably catching a lot of fish, and it's a pretty big business. And they're leaving that to go follow Jesus full time. So James in the Bible. So he's not really mentioned a lot by himself, right? He's almost always mentioned with someone else, and he's usually mentioned with his brother John, right? But if you ever notice, he's actually always mentioned first, right? We just read two passages. Both of them say James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John, right? So since he's mentioned first, what can we infer from that? He's older, right? So he's the older of the two brothers. We see him at the Transfiguration. I'm probably going to do that one 2 weeks from now, the Transfiguration, since we'll have the whole class with us. And so there was only 3 disciples at the Transfiguration, right? And they were Peter, James, and John, right? And if you don't know, this is a moment where the disciples hear God on a mountaintop say, "This is my beloved son, with whom I am well pleased," right? And they also see the spirit of Elijah and Moses, right? And Jesus, when they're coming down, tells them, "Do not tell anyone about this until I have raised from the dead," right? So it's very special for 3 disciples to have been there at that moment, because not many people get to witness such a thing like that and get to actually hear directly from God and the voice of God. We don't see James very often as a leading figure, and we don't see him alone in Scripture preaching. Once again, kind of like Andrew, he's a little bit of a backseat character, but we know that he is a prominent figure of the disciples because he's always mentioned a lot, especially with the big 4. And he was at the Transfiguration, so obviously Christ thought it was important for him to be there. So some interesting stories that we find with James being mentioned in the Bible. There's a one story, there's 2 different versions. One, he's asking the question, and the other one, his mommy's asking Jesus the question, right? And I'm sure that must be very embarrassing for your mom to ask Jesus something for you, right? Why can't you ask it yourself? You're a grown man, right? This is not a little kid. These are grown men, right? And so here's the request from James and John according to Mark. Then James and John, notice James came first, the sons of Zebedee came to him. "Teacher," they said, "we want to we want you to do for us whatever we ask." "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in glory." And Jesus says, "You don't know what you're asking for. Can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with?" "We can," they answered. And then we'll go on to Matthew. And so Matthew's version of this is a little bit different. It's the same request, but it's coming from his mommy. The mother of the Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling down, asked a favor of him. And "What is it you want?" he asked. She said, "Grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom." "You do not know what you are asking," Jesus said to them. "Can you drink the cup I am going to drink?" "We can," they answered. And Jesus said to them, "You will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right or my left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father." Right? So we often hear about Jesus sitting at the right hand of the Father, right? So if Jesus is at the right hand of the Father, who is on Jesus' left? God. God's on his left. So nobody can sit on his left. Who can sit on Jesus' right? I don't know. That's not mentioned here, and I didn't have enough time to look that up. But I'm sure there's many people who would probably come before the disciples. Maybe it's John the Baptist, or Moses, or Elijah, or maybe someone completely different, right? But yeah, so anyways, there was a request by James and John, and also their mother, to sit at Jesus' left and right. And we don't really see James very often in the Bible other than that. There is, here we go, another story about Samaritans. We learned that Samaria, right, was in between the Sea of Galilee and Jerusalem, right? And so here's a story about a Samaritan village. And as the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them. Then he and his disciples went to another village. So, pretty interesting story here about James and John, right? They didn't think that Jesus was welcome there. And so James and John are like, "Jesus, we'll call down fire from heaven and destroy them like Sodom and Gomorrah," right? Good for them for having the faith to say that. Jesus obviously didn't think it was such a great idea at the time. And remember this story when we go to talk about their nickname. That'll come later on. Or maybe, oh yeah, it's coming up right here. All right, and here we can see that James and John had a nickname. So it's talking about the 12. Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted. And they came to him. He appointed 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. These are the 12 he appointed: Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter; James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. To them he gave the name Boanerges, I had to remember how to say that, which means sons of thunder; Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. So we can see here, apparently, Jesus called James and John, the brothers, he called them sons of thunder, right? We don't really see this too often in the Bible, though, but we know it's there, right? We know that he gave them this nickname. It's different than Peter's nickname. Peter's nickname is expressly called out when he received the nickname from Jesus, right? You shall be referred to as Cephas, right? Or you shall be called Cephas. And he kind of goes back and forth about when to use that name, whether to build him up or to break him down, because Peter means the rock. So here we have the sons of Zebedee are being called the sons of thunder. And I'm telling you, if I have a Christian band, I'm calling it Sons of Thunder. Right here, right now. Who wants to join me? Okay. But I think that's why does nobody have a Christian band called Sons of Thunder? Right? I don't know. Like, the moment I heard that name, I was like, man, that's a cool name for a band. Anyway, so we have the Sons of Thunder. And this is pretty much the only verse where we really see that name being used in the whole New Testament, which I find very interesting that we get that from Mark. Because we see the name Peter used quite often, right? But we don't necessarily see Sons of Thunder being used. Okay, so Sons of Thunder, also called Boanerges. I put that there so I can remember how to say it. That's the Hebrew for Sons of Thunder. We don't know any specifics, right? We don't know how they got this nickname. Why did Jesus decide to call them the Sons of Thunder? Often when we think of thunder, right, and we're talking about in aspects of religion, it's more or less like today it's a very pagan thing, right? We're talking about like Thor, right? Or one of the Roman gods of like Jupiter or something, right? And so at the time, there were Roman gods that referred to thunder, right? Zeus has lightning, so I'm assuming he has some sort of thunder or something in their pagan religion. So maybe they didn't really care about the Roman religions, or it didn't really affect them. But anyways, he decided to call them the Sons of Thunder. So biblically, we can't back this up. We don't know why they got this name. Some people think it's because of the brothers' personality, right? They were very tenacious. We just heard them say, Jesus, you want us to call down fire from heaven and destroy that whole village? Right? That's a pretty tenacious thing to do, right? Call down fire from heaven to completely destroy a village, right? So maybe it's because of that. Maybe they were loud and boisterous, right? But they're also brothers, so they're the sons of someone, right? So maybe their father was that way. Maybe he was very loud and proud, right? Maybe he talked very, and maybe he had a deep voice. Maybe they had deep voices too, and they, that's how they got the nickname. We don't know, right? But we do know they got a really cool nickname from Jesus, and that's awesome. So, Boanerges. The emphasis is on the N-E-R. Boanerges. Or you can just say Sons of Thunder. Okay, so the book of James, he did not write James. Okay? So we have several James mentioned in the New Testament. So we have this one, right? And we know there's another James who was the son of Alphaeus, right? He's another disciple. We'll learn about him in a few weeks. But then there's the Epistle of James, right? Then does anybody know who wrote the book of James? Give you a hint, his name was James. James wrote James. He was actually a half-brother of Jesus, right? But we're not going to mention him. He's not going to be learned about in the 12 disciples, that'll be another thing we'll go on to for another day. So, I say this, it's important when you're reading a book of the Bible to know who the author is, right? You get that context of the story, right? Things kind of open up for you a little bit more. There's also some humor in it. I always get a chuckle in Matthew when he's talking bad about tax collectors. It just makes me laugh. I don't know why. Maybe it makes everybody else laugh too if you think about the context. For me, it really makes me laugh. Okay, so after Christ's resurrection and ascension, we don't really hear a lot about James. Kind of like some of the other disciples. We know that they were very important in the early church, right? But we don't necessarily see that quite in Scripture all that much. We see it a lot with Peter and John, but not necessarily with all of the disciples. We do know that he continued to be a early church leader for about 10 years, maybe 12 years, until he was killed. He was an early church leader in both Jerusalem and Samaria. So we kind of know the area that he worked as an early church leader, right? And we know that he's the patron saint of Spain. So I don't really get into the whole patron saint things, but it's good to be able to tie certain disciples and people to geographic regions just for common knowledge, right? You often see on flags, you'll see that X-shaped cross, because that's the cross of St. Andrew, right? Oh, and so besides Judas Iscariot, James's death is the only one of the 12 mentioned in the New Testament. And so he was the first disciple to die a martyr's death. And it was under King Herod. Now, I get confused by this. There's a lot of King Herods in the Bible, right? There is a King Herod when Jesus is born, right? There's a King Herod who cuts off John the Baptist's head, right? And there's another King Herod, I think it's a different King Herod, that kills James, right? And so I had to look this up. There's actually 6 different kings that go by the name of Herod, right? So maybe that'll be another study too, because I always get so confused when they're like, King Herod this, and then he died, so then we did this. And then King Herod did this, and then he died, so then it was fine, and we did this, right? Has anyone else ever been confused by that, right? So, yes, there are 6 King Herods in the New Testament. So let's read about here from Acts chapter 12 about how James was killed. And about that time, King Herod Agrippa began to persecute some believers in the church. He had the apostle James, John's brother, killed with a sword. When Herod saw how much this pleased the Jewish people, he also arrested Peter. This took place during the Passover celebration. Then he imprisoned him, placing him under guard of 4 squads of 4 soldiers each. Herod intended to bring Peter out for public trial after the Passover, but while Peter was in prison, the church prayed very earnestly for him. So the first part of this scripture is about James, and it just basically says he died by the sword. So it doesn't give us any more information than that. History tells us that when the Romans would kill somebody with a sword, it was usually often a beheading, right? And as gruesome as that sounds, it's actually a pretty quick and painless death. Or at least so I'm told, right? I never experienced it myself. If it ever happens, I'll be sure to let you know. But so it's not a crucifixion, right? Crucifixion is a very long and painful way to die. Being beheaded is very quick and painless. It's actually almost seen as I don't want to say blessing because you're still dying, right? But you don't have to go through all of that agony. So generally, there was a Roman soldier, and this was pretty much his job, was to behead people. Can you imagine if that was your job? And they would use a really big sword, big enough to be used with two hands, and they would often have the person kneel, sometimes blindfolded, and they would have their hands tied together either in front or behind their back, and then they would try to cut the head off in one fell swoop. Because they didn't want the person to suffer, but they needed to die according to whatever the Roman law was, right? So once again, we've always talked about the Romans. They were very good at killing people, and so whenever they did it, they wanted to do a good job at it. So if they were going to behead someone, they wanted to behead them correctly, with a painless death, and if they were going to crucify them, they were going to make it very, very, very painful, right? So this is how James was put to death by a sword, and we assume it was a beheading. Yes, and he's the first of the 11 to be martyred, and the only one mentioned in the New Testament. Everyone else is after the books were written or mentioned. So, all right, and that is James, and the next time we gather again, we'll be talking about John.